In this nugget, we're going to be taking a look at group policy objects. This will be the first probably of many different discussions regarding group policy. We're going to start here talking about client-side extensions, and those kind of feed directly into when policies get updated and how they get updated. And then we're also going to talk about group policy object caching. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, the other day my wife came into my office and saw the computer screen that I use, which is one of those that you can draw on. That's why I do all my little scribbles and all of this kind of stuff. And she just decided to start doing some artwork. You'll be glad that her artwork is a little better than mine, much better than mine. And so she decided to wish everyone a Merry Christmas. So there you go. Looks kind of like the Grinch has been to her Christmas tree because there's only one present left, and looks like all of the lights have been taken off. But anyway, Merry Christmas to you. It's the day after Christmas, actually. Let's take a look here, though, as we get started with group policy, about really just reviewing what group policy is. Now, at this level, I think you're probably somewhat familiar with it, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but the basic idea here is it controls the entire user experience. Virtually everything that the user can see and do can be affected by group policy. You don't want them to see, for example, the screensaver tab at a control panel. Well, you can hide that. You don't want them to see any of the control panel. Well, you can hide that too. You want to control their security settings. You can do that as well, what their password policy is, whether or not using complexity, the length of the password, when it expires. All those things are configured there, as well as much of the settings for things like certificate settings. A lot of other security settings go on there. You can configure the system settings as well. For example, how the event logs get stored. You can take a look at installing software. These are just some examples. This is a very short list. You can install software using group policy. Now, not a lot of people do that anymore. I think when group policy first came out with Active Directory years ago, we did that a little bit more often then. I've installed Microsoft Office with it. There's better solutions now for doing that sort of thing. But you can do it. You can install Acrobat Reader. Is that what they call it now? They used to just, I think they just call it Adobe Reader now. But anyway, WinZip. Lots of other little software utilities that you could install using group policy if you so choose. Now, one thing that's critically important to understand about group policy is the actual processing that takes place with it. So we're going to go ahead and address that now. And this really dovetails almost synonymously in places to what's called CSC processing, which is client-side extensions processing. We have, first of all, foreground processing, which is also known as synchronous processing. Okay, I'll just put sync right there, as opposed to asynchronous processing. Let me describe that a little bit. When you first start up the computer, it needs to read any policies that apply to the computer configuration side of policies, and it'll look through all of the applicable policies and apply them as necessary before you get to the logon screen. In other words, by the time you get to the logon screen, all of those policies should have been processed in the foreground processing, and that all takes place synchronously. Now, the user side of things, they're still going to get synchronous foreground processing there, but what will happen is when the user enters in their username and password and presses enter, they don't see a desktop until the foreground synchronous processing has completed. Now, when do they receive synchronous processing? It's not just every time the user logs in. Sometimes we've kind of said in the past, I think that it's kind of a blanket statement that they do, but that's not technically completely true. What happens is the first time a user logs on to a machine with a brand new profile, the group policy settings will process synchronously here. Now, here's something to think about here. Because of the foreground and synchronous processing, synchronous nature of all of this, this does happen a little bit more slowly. Okay, this can be kind of slow. Depending on the size of the organization, the number of policies that you have to read, and the number of additional settings that are configured. For example, we'll look at this more later on as we discuss group policy. But if there's a lot of enforced policies, if there's a lot of policies that have WMI processing involved, a lot of that kind of stuff, this can take a little while. And if you're over a slow WAN link or you're over a VPN connection that's kind of slow as well, you might have to wait a little while before this completes. In addition, there are four client-side extensions that are actually implemented in a group policy object by a computer or by a user. This is going to include folder redirection, which is where you can take something like a user's My Documents or Documents folder and redirect that to a network location, which is kind of a common practice to kind of corral all the user's documents together onto a server. There's also software installation, there's disk quotas, And there's group policy preferences for drive mappings. And I thought I'd just actually write those out for you there, because otherwise it's kind of hard to just listen to them and memorize them or something. So here are the client-side extensions: folder redirection, software installation, disk quota, and group policy preferences drive mappings. Now here's the thing. This all applies up to Windows 8 and Windows Server 2012, all right? But starting with 8.1 and 2012 R2, these two no longer apply for client-side extensions in terms of synchronous processing. They are still CSCs. They are still client-side extension processing. But if you have to apply one of these two, it's no longer synchronous. And then the other time that synchronous processing will occur is also whenever you go over here to apply this policy. Here I'm under computer configuration, policies, administrative template system, and then down here to log on. And there's this setting right here. Always wait for the network at computer startup and log on. Now, although it doesn't really say it in the title there, that really relates more to group policy object than a network connection, except that I guess it has to wait for the network connection to apply group policy. But if we enable this, then that forces synchronous processing. If we leave it deselected or disable it, then what will happen is it will take advantage of asynchronous processing whenever possible to speed up that logon process, that startup and logon process. Now put a push pin in all that stuff over to the right, because that becomes more relevant with group policy caching, which we'll discuss here in the future. But here we want to continue the discussion of GPO processing with background processing. Background processing, okay? And that's generally going to be asynchronous. Asynchronous processing. Now this will happen on all your domain members that are servers that are domain members or clients that are domain members every 90 to 120 minutes. There's just a random offset there to make sure that, that it's kind of a gut check for processing policy, to make sure that, do I have all the current processing of policies? Yep, I better double check. And so every 90 to 120 minutes it'll kick in. There's also domain controllers that will double check their own policy every 5 minutes, and that's obviously because domain controllers are more security sensitive, for example, and if we made a password policy change, we want to make sure that we have that updated more frequently. There's also GP Update. Let's just go ahead and take a look at GP Update, and here I'll just go to a command prompt, and you don't have to be an administrator to do the GP updates. Here you'll see that I'm logged on as Phoenix User 01, and really don't have any administrative privileges. I'll just do a who am I real quick. Who am I all, and you'll see that I think I'm just a domain user. Okay, nothing special in any of this stuff. Okay, there's not really a whole lot going on with that user account. Now let's take a look at GP Update. You can do a /? to look at all of the options, one of which is synchronous processing, and we talked about that just a moment ago. But normally, if I run GP Update right now without any options, it'll do it asynchronously. If I force it, though, it'll run it with synchronous processing so that the next foreground policy application is going to be done synchronously. This means that when the computer starts up and when the user logs on, it's going to force a synchronous processing. Now, you might look at my whiteboard here and you say, James, wait a minute, I thought you already told us that any time the computer starts up or the user logs on, it's already synchronous processing. Yes, but remember, for the user, it really only applies if we have these client-side extensions that are in place. And for 8.1 and 2012 R2, it's really only these top two. Okay, and if these two apply, then it's going to do synchronous processing. Otherwise, it's going to be asynchronous. Okay, so the other thing we can do is to force a group policy processing. So let me clear the screen here, and I'll do a GP Update, for example, and press Enter. And that'll just look at group policies on my domain controller, and it looks to see if there's a version number change in the policies that it sees there compared to the policies that it ran the last time. If you take a look at group policy, it does have a version number. If they're all the same, then it really doesn't do anything. It just kind of compares the policies to see if anything has changed. One thing I could also do, though, is if I want to kind of double check that, I could do a force, and I can say even if there's no change to the version of policies that are on the domain controller, go ahead and reapply them anyway. And that's what generally we kind of do that just out of habit. Most administrators will use the force option regardless. And then we have another way of applying group policy, and that's within the Group Policy Management console. For example, here I'm in the Phoenix Desktops organizational unit, and I have two computers in there. You don't see them in the GPMC. But if I right-click here to choose Group Policy Update, then it tells me that there are two computers there. All I got to do is to click on yes. And what really happens is it will update the policy within about 10 minutes. It's not quite immediate, but it's pretty quick, and it's much better than individually going around to dozens, hundreds of computers and trying to do this on each workstation. All right, now remember that I said to put a push pin in all this stuff over here to the right about group policy object processing, client-side extensions. Remember, there's 4 client-side extensions. And these are all 4 client-side extensions. It's just that they only apply synchronous processing now under 8.1 and 2012 R2 when these top 2 are being applied. That would be folder redirection and software installation. That in mind, let's go to group policy caching. The advantage of group policy caching is supposed to be that it speeds up synchronous processing. And this is only going to apply to Windows Server 2012 R2 or 8.1. What happens is it's going to cache the group policy object during its background processing. Now, when is background processing? Remember, that's the asynchronous processing that takes place every 90 to 120 minutes or every 5 minutes on domain controllers. And what it really does is, you see here, I just took a screenshot of it. It stores the policies, a copy of the policies using their unique GUIDs, and it will store those under the sysvol and the name of the domain and then policies for both the user side of things and the computer side of things. Now, for the user side of things, that's this bottom one down here, that will appear in the user's profile. And here I just switched over to a computer because you couldn't really see the whole title up there, or the whole path. So you can see here it's under users, Phoenix, the name of the user that is, app data, local group policy, data store 0, sysvol, Nugget Lab in my case, or the name of the domain, and then policies. Now you don't have to memorize that path. I'm just showing you that it does exist up there. Now the other place that it will appear is going to be under Windows, and then System 32. Let me go down to System 32 here. System 32. And then you'll have a group policy section here, data store 0, sysvol, name of the domain, policies, and then here's all of the policies there. And again, I just kind of highlighted up at the top for your reference. Again, you don't have to memorize that. I'm just pointing out that the group policy caching does cache these policies in those 2 locations. The reason why it's in those 2 locations is because part of the policies that appear under the user's profile only apply to the user side processing of the policy. The computer side policies will be here under the computer side, under the System 32, as I'm showing you right here. Now again, the advantage of this is supposed to be that it improves performance. I'm not really quite sure that it does in all situations, however. Because if the group policy object is synchronous, then what's going to happen is it will use those cached local copies that I just showed you. But the problem is, when does synchronous processing happen anymore for the user side of things, at least? Only during software installation and folder redirection. How often does that happen? Not very often. So it's a little bit of a narrow scope of times when you're going to actually get advantages with group policy caching here. But if you do use it, it should improve your policy processing. If the group policy object is asynchronous, for example, what happens during background processing, then it's going to download the policy from the domain controller, and then when it does that, it'll obviously read it, and then again, it's going to cache it into the cached location that I just described. In this nugget, we discussed group policy objects. We started with client-side extensions, foreground, background policy, processing, synchronous, asynchronous processing. All of that really relates to the updates that we discussed. And you also have to have an understanding of whether it's synchronous or asynchronous as well when it comes to caching group policy objects. Go ahead and stick around for our next nugget where we'll continue our discussion of group policy objects. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.